Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L, Glover, G-L-O-V-E-R. I was born March 17th, 1948. The circumstances with which I enlisted were like everybody in the mid to late 1960s. There was this thing called the draft. And when your number came up, you started figuring out, okay, the military is going to happen, what do I do? And so I decided, well, I don't want to go to Vietnam, so I'll enlist in the Air Force. And I enlisted in the Air Force and ended up in Vietnam. Sometimes things don't work out the way you plan. A lot of my friends chose to enlist, wanted to go to Vietnam to be in combat, to do the thing. And so a lot of them joined the Marines. A lot of them joined the Army with the intent of going to Vietnam to see what this whole war thing was all about. So I went to college just because that was what you did when you got out of high school, was go to college. Went to Western Illinois University, not having a clue what I wanted to do, and not surprisingly, I had a spectacularly unsuccessful college career. Lasted a year, and then I left college and went back home and just kind of hung around. And okay, the next thing in life is probably the military, so let's do that. And I went to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, where I did basic training. And when I enlisted, you had to take a language course test. So I took a language test and apparently scored fairly well on it. And they said, well, we think we can put you to use in a language capacity. And they sent me off to learn a little Vietnamese. And so when they sent me off to learn a little Vietnamese, I had a pretty good idea where I was headed. And so I did that, and then I ended up in Vietnam, teaching English to officers in the Vietnamese military who were going to come to America to be trained, largely to become pilots. Part of the drill was an intensive English course. So even though we had learned a little bit of Vietnamese, we were prohibited from speaking any Vietnamese in class. We could only speak English because their goal was to learn English. It was a learning experience. It was a growth experience. More than anything else, I didn't know when I was in college the first time, I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do with my life. And I was basically just drifting. And this was an experience where I could go out and see other things, do other things, be around other people, be in a different place, and learn things. And what it taught me was that I needed a direction. I needed a place to go, something to go. And so it gave me motivation to figure out what to do with my life. And also it was during that period that I actually met some journalists, and they were the first people I'd ever met who actually enjoyed what they did. Because when I grew up in Illinois, everybody worked and everybody hated their job, but you had to have a job because you had to make a living. And these were the first people I'd ever met who actually enjoyed what they did and took some meaning from what they did. And so I started thinking about maybe that's a direction I could pursue. Vietnam was a very funny war, a very different war, because we were largely based at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, which is outside of Saigon, although we had a couple of other places where we taught. So you met a lot of people, but a lot of transient people. And I don't know if you're familiar with wars. In a lot of ways, you're a little reluctant to form relationships with people, largely because they could be gone tomorrow because they're sent somewhere else, or they step on a landmine. So you don't really form a lot of relationships. It's all very transient. Actually, the most interesting relationships I formed were with students, because they were coming to the U.S. after they learned English, and so they wanted to know what the United States was like, and so they would invite you over to their house to have food and dinner and that sort of stuff, and try to find out what the United States was like. So I got a lot of experience in eating Vietnamese food. We stayed at a hotel in Cholan, which is the Chinese section of Saigon. And so we stayed in the hotel, and when we got off work, we kind of roamed around the city, getting in trouble and doing all that kind of stuff. What sort of things would a single 21-year-old man do in a strange Asian city? Probably not things that I'd want to tell my daughter about. You could buy, for $1, a pack of cigarettes, Marlboros, that had the cellophane around them and had the tax stamp on them, but when you opened it, it was 20 joints. And it cost $1. And the joints looked like cigarettes, but it was marijuana. And that was readily available. You could buy that on any street corner. And one of the real downsides was in the late 60s, drugs became a major issue for everybody in the country. Drugs were readily available, incredibly cheap, and lots of people did them. I had a friend who got heavily involved in drugs and decided, because when he rotated back, you had to take a urine test. And so he decided a couple weeks before he was scheduled to rotate back to stop doing drugs, and discovered he couldn't. Because one of the things they did was, in addition to the packs of joints, you could buy a pack of cigarettes where the tobacco was laced with heroin. And the upside of that was you could smoke a cigarette laced with heroin, and it didn't smell like marijuana. It was like you were smoking a cigarette. And he did that for most of his tour there, and discovered a couple weeks before he rotated back, okay, I'll stop doing this, and discovered he was hooked. We got to have our own escapism. Because part of, you got to understand the mentality of it. Part of the mentality was we were in a country we didn't want to be in a war we didn't believe in, we knew the country didn't believe in, and we weren't stupid. And so it's, let's get through this year, and what can you do to help you get through this year? Well, everybody chose their outlet, and a lot of people chose drugs, a lot of people chose booze, a lot of people chose just escapism. Everybody chooses their getaway. The food was okay. We ate at the base, so it was just military food, which tends to be, just starch, and let's give him something that's going to make him not be hungry for a few hours and not worry about much else. They kind of knew that holidays were a bad time, and so they downplayed them. They didn't really observe most of the holidays because they knew that people didn't want to be reminded that, okay, it's Thanksgiving and I'm not home. Everybody has this story. We used to compare the worst breakup letters that we got, and I think I won. I got a letter from a lady that I'd been dating, and it wasn't a letter, it was a newspaper clipping of her wedding announcement. And that took the prize as the worst breakup letter in the group. I wasn't in the most dangerous, but you're in Vietnam, in a country that's at war, and hearing gunshots was not all that unusual. And you start thinking, I've got a month to go before I go home, so I've got to make it through the next month. When you're there at the beginning of the tour, it's a year, and you can't think about that. But when it gets to be a month or so, yeah, everybody has their short time calendar where you get up in the morning and you mark off the previous day. I made it through that day, and then I make it through this day, and I'll make it through that day. But that makes for very long days, very long days. You had to go to a processing center that was at Tan Son Nhut, and you had to turn in your weapon, because you got issued an M16 when you got there, and turn that in and turn in other gear that you gotten for a combat zone. And then since you had to stay at Tonsanute for a day, because now you had no weapon, so you couldn't be outside the base. And then you spent a day and then caught a plane home. Flying Tiger Airlines, which was an airline that was formed to transport people back and forth to Vietnam. And it was Flying Tiger Airlines. I don't remember what kind of a plane it was, but I remember it was hideously overloaded. And the air base at Lakota ended at a cliff over the ocean. And I'll swear, when we got to the end of the runway, we went down. But we didn't go all the way down to the water, but we came back up and did the polar route and did a brief refueling stop in Alaska and then flew back to the U.S. It was a long flight, long flight. That was a strange, strange thing, because I didn't feel like I was home. I didn't know what home was anymore. I remember we landed in California, and I stayed there for a couple of days, 3 days. I didn't know. We all had, you had to travel. When you fly military standby, you have to wear your uniform. Well, the only uniform I had were my jungle fatigues. They'd been washed about 6 months prior to that. So we spent a couple of days in California knocking around, and then I woke up. I remember, I didn't wake up. I got back to the hotel at like 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning and thought to myself, I think I'll go home. So I put on these jungle fatigues and caught a cab to the airport. And when you fly military standby, you're the top priority standby, and they fill airplanes from the front to the back. So I got to the airport in San Francisco at like 6 on a Sunday morning or something, and they stuck me on the first available flight in first class. So here I am in first class wearing these stinking jungle fatigues to fly back home. I didn't know what to do, but I knew that I had an idea that journalism was something that could be important and something I might want to pursue, but I was still pulling my head together. I mean, you're a kid, and you're still trying to sort everything out. So I went back to Western Illinois University and finished my degree. Vietnam was such a freaking disaster and such a mistake that we lost all faith in government. We all kind of grow up thinking, oh, government's okay. That completely destroyed that. It made you question everything that the establishment said or did. You no longer accepted it as, okay, it's the government, it's okay. It's the government, you better question this. As a journalist, you ought to question everything. And that taught you that. What you do at the end of the day is secondary to who you are. And who you are the people you surround yourself with and the people you are with. And that's what makes you who you are, and what you do is how you pay for that. Now, I was fortunate because I happened to do something that I loved doing. And that paid for everything else. But the really important thing is the people you surround yourself with. And that's what's really important.